Layer 1. Don't mention the war. Don't mention the war is a phrase from a 1975 episode of Fawlty Towers, which is a beloved sitcom in Britain. The episode revolves around the main character, Basil Fawlty, hosting a group of Germans at the titular Fawlty Towers hotel. Basil orders his staff not to mention the quote-unquote war, by which he means World War II, but after getting concussed, he berates his guests by repeatedly referencing the Nazis and goose-stepping. The episode became the centre of a small controversy during the George Floyd movement because a character in the episode uses incredibly racist language. To be fair to the makers of Fawlty Towers, this was clearly intended to be a criticism of racism, but it did lead to the episode being temporarily removed from streaming services in 2020. That controversy seems to have disappeared into the background, and the episode is still fondly remembered in Britain today. The phrase, "don't mention the war," has since gone on to represent the inherent awkwardness of Anglo-German relations given our shared and somewhat troubled history, and it is frequently referenced in British pop culture.
Don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it. I don't agree with that in the workplace. I don't agree with that in the workplace.
No bins on the tube. One thing that often shocks a lot of tourists in London is how few bins there are, especially in London's metro, which is called the Tube. The reason that there are so few bins on the Tube is because of the IRA. During the height of the Troubles, the IRA conducted a sustained bombing campaign in several English cities, including London. A bin makes for an inconspicuous receptacle for a bomb, which is why one was used by the IRA at London's Victoria Station in 1991. The subsequent explosion killed one person and injured several more. After the Victoria bombing, bins were mostly removed from train stations for public safety, although they have been slowly returning. Now it's common to see these kind of halfway bins that are just a transparent white bag. £350 million. So during the Brexit referendum, the Vote Leave campaign arranged for a big red bus to tour around the UK with the words, "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead," emblazoned on the side. The Vote Leave bus was supported by future British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and snake in human clothing Michael Gove, pictured here in his natural habitat. That £350 million figure was immediately criticised because it was basically a lie. It didn't take into account the rebate that the UK received by being an EU member, which was deducted before any money was paid. The message also didn't qualify that much of that money went back into the UK economy, but it didn't seem to matter because it was a nice, round, understandable figure. After Vote Leave narrowly won the Brexit referendum, criticism over that figure increased. There were even talks about criminally charging Boris Johnson for lying, although that kind of fizzled out. I think it's safe to say that most British people recognise the term £350 million as a microcosm of shameless political deception.
He said you had one overriding quality, have I got this right? Which was disloyalty.
I think I have many other good qualities as well.
Yeah. I can't think of any, but that's a good one.
Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was a Catholic terrorist who was part of a conspiracy to blow up Parliament and kill King James I in the early 1600s. At the time, England was transitioning away from Catholicism towards a new branch of Christianity called Protestantism, and the plot was a far-fetched scheme by Fawkes and his co-conspirators to re-establish Catholic rule of England.
You're a Catholic and I'm a Catholic and the King hates Catholics. He seems to think we're always plotting something. As if.
Fawkes was not the principal actor of the conspiracy, but he was the first to be identified and arrested after he was found with 36 barrels of gunpowder near the House of Lords. The so-called gunpowder plot was foiled, and most men involved in the conspiracy, including Fawkes himself, were horribly tortured and executed. Since then, the date Guy Fawkes was captured, November 5th, is celebrated in Britain with bonfires and fireworks, because we love irony. It's quite common to refer to Fawkes as the last man to enter Parliament with honest intentions, which is one of those daddish jokes that live on simply because it's repeated so often. But Guy Fawkes' true legacy is probably just his face. The Guy Fawkes mask was used as a prop in the 1980s graphic novel V for Vendetta by the titular main character V, who hides his identity while engaging in illegal activity like blowing up Parliament. Following the popularity of the 2005 film adaptation, the Guy Fawkes mask has been used by various anti-government groups, most famously the decentralised hacktivist community Anonymous. Guy Fawkes is now understood as a symbol of extreme individualism and anarchy, virtues that the man himself would almost certainly not recognise. Gammons. Gammon is a pejorative political term that became popular in the late 2010s, named after a popular type of pork. It describes a kind of British voter, usually, although not exclusively, an English one. Typically, they are an older white man who expresses right-wing reactionary political views like being pro-Brexit or being anti-immigration. The name comes from the fact that men with views like this often have a sort of flushed, pale pink complexion. Some people argue that the term is ageist or even racist, but I'll leave that debate as an exercise for the comment section. Mr. Blobby. Mr. Blobby is a bizarre-looking character originally invented for a 1990s Saturday night programme hosted by the equally bizarre Noel Edmonds. He is a garish, 7-foot-tall humanoid creature who acts in a deliberately provocative and chaotic way. He speaks in an altered manic voice and can only communicate by repeating his own name.
You're right.
The character became increasingly popular with the British public despite, or perhaps because of, his incredibly weird and disturbing appearance. He has had a much bigger life outside the original programme in which he starred. He even released a UK #1 Christmas single, which used to be considered a high honour. Claudia Winkleman recently described Mr. Blobby as the British Mickey Mouse, and I think that is a fair assessment of where he sits in the British public imagination. Mr. Blobby has since gone on to greater and greater heights, like destroying the set of This Morning and scaring Jack Whitehall.
What are you allowed near kids?
Layer 2. Milk Snatcher. Before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, she held the title of Education Secretary under Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath. In an attempt to reduce public expenditure in the early 1970s, the Conservative government cut spending for the state education system, with the most famous and controversial change being the end of free school milk for children between the ages of 7 and 11. As Thatcher was Education Secretary, she took most of the blame, and it earned her the nickname of Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher. In fairness to Thatcher, dropping free milk for those above the age of 7 wasn't actually her idea, and she privately opposed the move. But the nickname stuck, and it's still commonly used by her detractors today. Russell Brand prank calls. Before he became infamous for other reasons, Russell Brand hosted a weekly BBC radio show aptly called The Russell Brand Show. In a 2008 episode co-hosted with Jonathan Ross, both men left crass and sexually charged voicemails on the answering machine of actor Andrew Sachs, who was due on the show as a phone-in guest. Across the 4 voicemails, Brand and Ross referenced the former's brief relationship with Sachs's granddaughter, as well as the character that Sachs played in the aforementioned beloved sitcom Fawlty Towers. Despite initially receiving little attention, the controversy drastically intensified across the final months of 2008, to the point that the story eclipsed objectively more important news like the financial crisis and Obama's election victory. Saxgate, as the incident is sometimes called, resulted in several high-profile resignations at the BBC, in addition to a whopping £150,000 fine. Ross, for his part, seems to have escaped the controversy relatively unscathed, and Brand, well, he's America's problem now. MPs can't resign. A Member of Parliament, or MP, is a UK politician who is elected to the House of Commons, which is the British equivalent of the US House of Representatives. By law, MPs are elected to serve a whole 5-ish year term, making it legally impossible for an MP to resign before the end of their tenure. An MP who wants to resign their seat before the end of Parliament has to disqualify themselves by being appointed to one of 2 offices of profit under the Crown. Either the Crown Steward and Bailiff of the Chiltern Hundreds or the Crown Steward and Bailiff of the Manor of Northstead. These titles are total nonsensical legal fiction that don't have any real-world applications like responsibilities or a salary. The reason that this weird tradition exists is because being an MP has only recently become a job that some people actually want to do. Being an MP in the age before roads and semi-competent public transport meant that travelling to Westminster was a long, arduous and unforgiving journey, so making it illegal to resign from Parliament was a handy way to stop MPs from just calling it quits. Now the tradition has been codified into law, meaning it's technically impossible for an MP to resign. If a resigning MP refuses one of the 2 offices of profit under the Crown, they're just made one without their consent. Gordon Banks' CIA conspiracy. Gordon Banks was an English footballer who is widely regarded as one of the best goalkeepers of all time. During the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico, Banks became severely ill and was replaced at the last second by a weaker goalkeeper. England ended up losing the match to West Germany 3-2. Because Banks was ruled out of the game at the last minute, it birthed several conspiracy theories postulating that he was poisoned to prevent England from winning the 1970 World Cup. The most popular conspiracy suggests that Brazil, who eventually won the championship, conspired with the CIA to poison Banks and ensure that their American-backed military dictatorship received a big morale boost. There is zero firm evidence to support any of this. Son, what won it? In the 1992 UK general election, the governing Conservative Party, led by John Major, unexpectedly won a small but secure majority in Parliament. This was a dramatic result because polls consistently showed that the main opposition party, Labour, would win the election instead. Pundits argued that John Major's win was facilitated by the aggressively anti-Labour newspaper The Sun, which was, and depending on how you count it, remains the most widely read newspaper in Britain. The Sun celebrated their successful endorsement of the Conservative Party with the now infamous headline, "It's the Sun what won it." The headline has since become a kind of shorthand for how much influence the press has over British elections. British Museum stolen artefacts. The British Museum in London is home to many artefacts across the world, including the Parthenian sculptures of Greece, the Rosetta Stone of Egypt, and the Benin bronzes of Nigeria. Depending on who you ask, these artefacts were either stolen as part of Britain's morally outrageous imperial war efforts, or taken with the full consent of their hosts by well-intentioned collectors, although the former view is more widely accepted today. Because many of these objects were likely stolen, some institutions and activists argue that Britain should repatriate them to their country of origin. The British Museum, for its part, argues that it would be illegal to do this under UK law, so until the law changes, these artefacts are staying put. Horse meat. There was a major scandal in the early 2010s after Irish health authorities found that many common store-bought beef products, like burgers and ready meals, had been fraudulently substituted with horse meat. Irish and UK supermarket supply chains are highly integrated, so the scandal was a massive news story in the British press, and suppliers for many recognisable store brands like Tesco and Asda were implicated. Investigators discovered that the horse meat had originated from Romanian abattoirs via two companies based in Cyprus and the Netherlands, who then knowingly mislabelled the food as beef. Horse meat isn't unsafe to eat, but it's not a common and widely accepted part of the British diet, to put it mildly, and the whole scandal laid bare the precarity of the food processing system and the British public's lack of awareness of the wider supply chain. People my age still make jokes about it. Layer 3. Knife crime. Knife crime is a serious and real problem in Britain and London, which has inspired a lot of stupid memes. But recent police figures suggest that knife crime has seen its sharpest drop in years, if you can pardon the pun. Suez Crisis. The 1956 Suez Crisis was an international conflict in the Middle East which began after Egypt nationalised the Suez Canal, which is an important trade route between Europe and Asia. The company that owned the Suez Canal was mostly run by British and French shareholders, so British Prime Minister Anthony Eden launched a coordinated attack against Egypt alongside France and Israel. But the entire operation collapsed following international pressure, and Britain was left totally humiliated. Eden's reputation never recovered, and he resigned in disgrace a few months later. The Suez Crisis is often held up as a symbol of Britain's declining influence in world affairs, and it still holds relevancy for some older British people who lived through it. Transphobia. Transphobia is the irrational fear, hatred, or prejudice of transgender people. By most global standards, the UK is one of the safest countries on earth to be queer, but trans rights in the UK have noticeably worsened in recent years. Anti-trans hate crimes have increased precipitously in concert with a broader trend that has unfortunately been mirrored across the free world. The anti-trans movement is particularly pronounced in the UK. ILGA Europe's 2025 Rainbow Map shows that the UK is now one of the least safe countries in Western Europe to be queer, mostly due to the weakening of trans rights. Transgender culture war issues have an objectively oversized role in British public discourse given the minuscule proportion of the country's trans population. According to the most recent census, only about 0.5% of the population identify as trans, and even this is probably an overestimate. Despite this reality, candidates for Prime Minister are regularly forced to endure gotcha-style what is a woman questions as a kind of verbal hazing ritual.
A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
I think this quote from Marie-Claire Chapet sums it up well. Trans people are no longer jokes but political chess pieces, used as leverage to create division and cultivate us versus them narratives in pursuit of electoral gain. Peace in our time. Peace in our time is a misquoted line from a speech made by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain shortly before the outbreak of World War II. In the late 1930s, Hitler's Germany was becoming increasingly aggressive towards its neighbours, and Chamberlain scrambled to prevent the resurgence of conflict in Europe. His cabinet initiated a policy of appeasement, which basically just meant giving Hitler what he wanted. The most infamous concession that Chamberlain helped negotiate was allowing Germany to annex parts of Czechoslovakia in exchange for Hitler's promise not to extend his borders any further. This deal was broadly acceptable to the British political class, and Chamberlain said that the arrangement, which Czechoslovakia obviously opposed, guaranteed peace for our time. Less than a year later, Europe was plunged into a devastating world war. Because of the abject failure of Chamberlain's appeasement policy and the irony of his peace for our time speech, his legacy remains controversial. He's generally considered one of the worst British prime ministers in history, alongside Lord North, who lost the American colonies, and Liz Truss, who lost to a head of lettuce. Even today, the term appeasement is a serious political charge in British politics, and has arguably led to post-war Western governments instituting more aggressive foreign policies than they otherwise would have, most infamously in the United States. Churchill's racism. Winston Churchill was, of course, Prime Minister of the UK, serving 2 non-consecutive terms in the mid-20th century. Churchill was a defining figure in the fight against European fascism, and his leadership was vital for maintaining British morale during World War II. He was also a terrible racist, a term that I use in the most literal sense of the word. Churchill was an imperialist who believed in white supremacy and racial hierarchy, and evidence of his racist beliefs are indisputable. Churchill's racist attitudes had devastating real-world consequences. The most infamous part of his legacy is the 1943 Bengal famine, which claimed between 2 to 4 million lives in British-run India. The famine was initially triggered by factors outside of his control, but as Prime Minister of the then British Empire, Churchill's policy decisions and racist beliefs potentially resulted in millions of unnecessary deaths. Fearing further intervention would reduce food stockpiles in the UK and Europe, his cabinet sent insufficient emergency relief to combat the humanitarian crisis, and there is evidence that Churchill's racist views partly, possibly even majorly, influenced the decision. The exact degree of Churchill's complicity in the famine is hotly debated by historians. It is still a relatively recent field of study, so I haven't come to any firm conclusions myself, but the question of how we should approach Churchill's legacy in light of his racist attitudes remains an animated discussion in British culture. Today, Churchill's racism has a similar place in the cultural consciousness as the Japanese internment camps do for FDR's legacy. Jack the Ripper's real identity. Jack the Ripper is a famous serial killer who operated in the East End of London during the late 1800s. Because we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, his legend has inspired a number of pseudo-historical theories about his true identity. You often see clickbait headlines by nationally syndicated publications claiming that Jack the Ripper's identity has been proven at long last. The most commonly publicized claim is that DNA evidence identified the killer as Aaron Kosminski, a Jewish man who emigrated to England from Poland. But the efficacy of this evidence is extraordinarily shallow. In reality, modern technology doesn't allow for the level of specificity required to prove a definitive match. We will probably never know who Jack the Ripper actually was. Layer 4. Guilty until proven innocent. If you're accused of a crime in the UK, you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. However, unlike similarly developed countries, British libel law is notoriously restrictive. In American courts, citizens are shielded by the First Amendment, meaning that a successful defamation claim needs to prove that an allegation was false and made with malicious intent. This is flipped in English courts, with the burden of proof placed on the accused. The restrictive nature of British libel law was depicted in the 2016 film Denial, based on the real case of Deborah Lipstadt, an American historian who accurately described a British writer as a Holocaust denier. The Holocaust denier sued Lipstadt in English court, forcing her to prove that her description of him was true, as opposed to him proving that what she said was defamatory.
Over here in America, if you're accused of defaming someone, then it's up to them to prove that what you said is untrue. In the UK, the reverse is true.
Wait, I have to prove what I said was true?
Correct.
Yes, but I'm the innocent party. A man accuses you of something and it's your job to prove he's wrong? It's against natural justice. In the US, there's a presumption of innocence.
Yeah, not in the UK.
Some recent reforms to British law have attempted to raise the threshold for bringing a defamation claim, but it's been argued that the system still has a freezing effect on free speech. On the other hand, it also forces journalists and writers to be very rigorous in their reporting, only releasing material if their coverage is factually accurate and legally airtight. Whether this trade-off ethically balances out in the long run is a matter of debate, but if at any point in this video it sounds like I'm being deliberately ambiguous when describing an event or person, this is why. Phone hacking scandal. News of the World was a weekly British tabloid that became engulfed in a firestorm controversy over its illicit and systemic strategy of phone hacking. Reporters working for News of the World targeted the private voicemails of celebrities, crime victims, and public figures to help write stories for the newspaper. When the controversy came to light in 2011, The Guardian discovered that News of the World journalists had previously hacked the phone of a murdered teenage girl called Millie Dowler. Another claim that News of the World journalists had deleted voice messages from Millie's phone was later proven incorrect. As you can probably imagine, the subsequent public outcry resulted in high-profile resignations and criminal convictions, in addition to the permanent closure of News of the World. It was an incredibly big news story at the time, and I remember people buying copies of the final issue for the sake of posterity. Many of the allegedly implicated individuals continued to have successful careers despite their alleged involvement in phone hacking practices. And for absolutely no reason at all, here is a clip of Piers Morgan spitting out a vegan sausage roll.
That's a good look, Piers.
Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson is a former diplomat who became a central figure in the UK Labour Party during Tony Blair's premiership. He reached the top echelons of political power, including a recent short stint as the UK's ambassador to the US, before resigning most of his political offices in disgrace due to his close association with Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson supported Epstein after he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from an underage girl, which included allegedly leaking confidential market-sensitive information to him. His appointment as ambassador to the US was monumentally embarrassing for the current governing Labour Party. Security vetting flagged his links to Epstein, but this was seemingly ignored, and it is one of the many factors that led to Keir Starmer's recent resignation as Prime Minister. Mandelson's fall from grace marked an ignoble end to a political career that frankly wasn't perceived as particularly noble to begin with. Princess Diana's death. Princess Diana died in a car crash in central Paris on August 31st, 1997, alongside her friend Dodi Fayed and the car's driver Henri Paul. Diana's bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones was seriously injured in the crash but thankfully survived. Diana's death was a collective national trauma, occupying a similar space in the British public consciousness as JFK's assassination in America. Henri was attempting to escape the paparazzi whilst also being 3 times over the legal drinking limit, and all 4 occupants weren't wearing their seatbelts at the time of the crash. It's generally accepted that had Diana wore her seatbelt, she would have likely survived. But like John F. Kennedy's death, this explanation seems too simple and perhaps even a little bit too boring to be true, birthing several outlandish conspiracy theories. The most prominent conspiracy theory originates from influential Egyptian businessman Mohammed al-Fayed, who was Dodi's father. Mohammed believed that the car crash was orchestrated by the British government on behalf of the royal family, in particular Prince Philip. His theory was that Diana was secretly due to marry Dodi and was pregnant with his child, which would have been considered unacceptable by the royal family on account of his nationality and religion. An inquiry by the Metropolitan Police set up in response to Mohammed's claims concluded that the theory had no merit, outlining definitive proof that Diana was almost certainly not pregnant at the time of her death. Despite this, a 2013 YouGov poll estimated that almost 4 in 10 Britons believed that her death was not an accident, a conclusion that has no evidence to support it. Personally, I believe that conspiracy theories like this are popular because they provide a psychological comfort blanket to fundamentally chaotic and seemingly impenetrable events. But that's just my opinion.
Remember what the Duke of Edinburgh said when he came in here to MI6 to give us our orders? I don't mind carrying the lifelong suspicion of murder on my shoulders as long as you kill her in such a way that absolutely nothing can go wrong.
Induced tipsy car crash it'll have to be then. It simply can't fail.
Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley was an infamous British fascist, anti-Semite and racist who was politically active in the years leading up to World War II. Mosley was a convincing orator who blamed Jewish people for just about everything. He's perhaps most notorious for a 1936 march in which he attempted to lead his fellow fascists into predominantly Jewish neighbourhoods in the East End of London, which resulted in mass violence. After the outbreak of the Second World War, Mosley was imprisoned and the fascist political party he helped lead was made illegal. He was released during the war under house arrest, before spending his final decades outside of the UK in self-imposed exile. Because of his disgusting fascist activism and rhetoric, Mosley is often regarded as one of the most hated Britons of all time. Section 28. Section 28 was an extremely controversial clause of a wider 1988 law called the Local Government Act. Section 28 banned local authorities from being able to intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, or promote the teaching of any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The clause was enacted in response to a children's picture book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, which aimed to educate young people about different types of family relationships. A moral panic over the book was stirred by the British tabloids, motivating Margaret Thatcher's government to enact the law.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Section 28 was never used to prosecute anyone in the UK, but the LGBTQ+ community, not unreasonably, heavily campaigned against it from the start. The clause is now widely regarded as a grossly offensive and homophobic law, even by many of the people who helped enact it. It was only fully repealed in 2003. Layer 5. Post Office Scandal. The Post Office Scandal is the worst miscarriage of justice in British history. Managers who operated local branches of the UK's Post Office as independent business owners were wrongly accused of financial crimes because of a faulty computer system called Horizon. Horizon regularly displayed quote-unquote missing money that didn't actually exist, but because branch managers were contractually responsible for any losses, they were ordered to repay the money out of their own pocket to cover non-existent shortfalls. The UK Post Office had private prosecutorial powers, which they used to legally accuse and convict 700 people falsely accused of financial crime between 1999 and 2015. Horizon's technical issues were reported to the Post Office and branch managers protested their innocence, but these concerns were widely ignored. Instead, leaders of the Post Office, in my personal political opinion, engaged in an elaborate cover-up to suppress evidence that could help clear the names of the wrongfully accused and ensure that the truth of their deception would remain hidden. Lobbying tactics, misinformation and outright lies helped slow the rate of discovery and contributed to further unnecessary suffering. In 2017, a group representing these local branch managers took legal action against the Post Office, who agreed to pay £58 million in compensation, but much of that money went on the group's legal fees. The scandal came to public attention following the release of a 2024 TV dramatisation called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. The success of the show forced political action on behalf of the wrongfully accused, and they have only very recently started to receive semi-adequate legal and financial redress. The Post Office scandal destroyed the lives of many of its victims, some of whom died before their names were cleared. It led to false imprisonment, the breakdown of marriages, and alcoholism, and more than 13 people may have killed themselves due to the scandal. The UK Post Office still uses the Horizon computing system today. Blood contamination scandal. In the 1970s and 1980s, about 6,000 people were treated with contaminated blood containing HIV and hepatitis. The main victims were those with bleeding disorders like haemophilia and people who received blood transfusions after childbirth, surgery or major trauma. The NHS, which is the UK's National Health Service, couldn't meet domestic demand for blood and blood-related products at the time, so it sourced around 50% from abroad, including the United States. At the time in the United States, donors were paid for giving blood, which attracted people from groups more likely to have HIV and hepatitis. And this blood wasn't initially screened for these viruses. Around 1,250 people in the UK with bleeding disorders went on to develop HIV, including 380 children, while thousands more contracted hepatitis. Some of the victims unintentionally passed their disease onto other people because they were unaware of the contaminated blood. Modern safety standards have improved since the scandal, and the NHS now almost never imports blood products from outside the UK, but that is little comfort to the victims. In 2017, then Prime Minister Theresa May announced a public inquiry into the scandal. The inquiry found that some documents related to the scandal were intentionally destroyed, and that the government misrepresented the risk of the contaminated blood. There is far less public awareness of this tragedy in the UK compared to the Post Office scandal, although an ITV dramatisation depicting the events might soon shine a spotlight on the victims and the perpetrators. To be clear, the blood contamination scandal has absolutely no relationship with blood donation, which is extremely safe. One of the main causes of the blood contamination scandal was low supply, and the UK currently faces dangerously low blood donation rates. As someone who regularly donates blood, believe me when I say that it is one of the most psychologically rewarding things a person can do. A single blood donation can save up to 3 lives, and it's safe, easy, and for many people like myself, completely painless. I'll include a link to the NHS's blood donation website in the description. If you were looking for a sign to start donating blood, this is it. Hugh Edwards. Hugh Edwards is a Welsh BBC News TV presenter whose career and public image collapsed after he pled guilty to making indecent images of children. He was initially accused of misconduct by the Sun newspaper, who referred to him anonymously as a quote-unquote well-known presenter. This triggered a 5-day witch hunt and national psychodrama where members of the public tried to figure out who the Sun was talking about, including wrongly identifying other nationally syndicated TV presenters and celebrities. Because Edwards presented coverage of major historical events like the Queen's death, his fall from grace is especially uncomfortable.
BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Much of his appearances have been removed from the BBC archive, including a cameo he had in an episode of Doctor Who. He's since started a Substack dedicated to mental health. Madeleine McCann. Madeleine McCann is the most famous missing child in British history. Madeleine was a 3-year-old girl from England who disappeared in 2007 from an apartment in Portugal while on holiday with her family. After news of her presumed abduction became public knowledge, the Portuguese police named Madeleine's parents as suspects, but they were eventually cleared due to lack of evidence. Despite extensive investigation by the police and widespread international attention, her disappearance remains unsolved. The amount of funding that has been given to Madeleine's disappearance is the subject of controversy in the UK. The Metropolitan Police's investigation, called Operation Grange, has totaled more than £13.2 million in public money since 2011. Suffice to say, not every missing child gets allocated that much money. Andrew Gosden. Andrew Gosden is a 14-year-old boy who disappeared mysteriously in 2007 in what is perhaps the most high-profile unsolved disappearance to take place on British soil. On the morning of his disappearance, Andrew left his house as if he were going to school. He returned home shortly after and changed out of his school uniform before withdrawing £200 from his bank account and boarding a one-way train ticket to London for unknown reasons. A return ticket would have cost about the same as the one he purchased, but he specifically requested it to be one way. His last confirmed sighting was on CCTV at King's Cross Station, where he vanished without a trace. Since Andrew's disappearance, there have been dozens of unconfirmed sightings of him across the UK, but there is no definitive proof about where he is or if he is still alive. Andrew was a highly intelligent teenager with an outstanding school attendance record, and there is no clear or obvious motive as to why he would have travelled to London on that particular day. Andrew's father, Kevin, runs an active blog in which he details further developments in the case. Here are 3 age-progressed images of Andrew as featured on Kevin's blog. Andrew has an unusual and distinctive double-ridged right ear, and he's deaf in the other ear, meaning that he would likely struggle to locate the direction of sounds. If you know or have ever met a man with an incomplete life history who matches that description, please contact the South Yorkshire Police or Missing Persons. Their details on the screen now. Just before we conclude, I want to flag that as per most iceberg meme explainer videos, the next layer discusses several distressing subjects. I'll try to be as unspecific as possible when talking about anything gory or disturbing, but viewer discretion is advised. I wanted to make a video that could act as a kind of British cultural dictionary, expanding on things that don't necessarily make international news. I was inspired by this JJ McCullough video, which I also recommend watching. Here is the full dark British culture iceberg that I made for those interested. If you pause the video now, you can quickly scan the bottom layer and decide for yourself if these are subjects that you want to hear more about. Jimmy Savile was a beloved English media presenter known for hosting several popular British TV shows. Before his death, he was most famous for his work on the BBC children's show Jim Will Fix It, which aired between 1975 and 1994. The premise of the show was that children would write to Savile with their biggest wish, which the show would then facilitate and arrange for them. Jim Will Fix It cemented Savile as a household name in Britain, and at the height of the show's popularity, children across the country collectively sent Savile 20,000 letters a week in the hopes of being featured on the programme. Given his odd appearance and mannerisms, Savile was considered eccentric during his lifetime, but he was generally respected for his extensive charity work. After Savile's death in 2011, an ITV documentary accused him of horrific sex crimes, prompting more than 100 people to come forward with further accusations against him. It quickly became apparent that Savile was a prolific and opportunistic sexual predator who used his decades-long celebrity status to prey on victims. Rumours of Savile's behaviour existed while he was alive, and the British media apparatus were presented with ample opportunities to stop him. But his celebrity status and a pervasive culture of fear at the BBC continually helped him to evade capture. The scandal warped perceptions of British cultural institutions and led to several prominent national figures being investigated for, and in some instances being criminally charged with, sexual abuse. In Britain, the name Jimmy Savile is now synonymous with infamy, disgust, and the systemic failure of institutions to curb sexual predation. As a child, my mum once wrote to Jim or Fix It in the hopes of being featured, and it's impossible to escape the thought that, if not for a random dint of luck, she could very well have become one of his many, many victims. Ian Watkins was a depraved and grotesque sex offender who committed appalling acts of cruelty while performing as the lead singer of a popular Welsh rock band called Lost Prophets. I can't bring myself to describe his crimes in detail. Before his conviction in 2013, Watkins was one of the most recognisable Welsh musicians in the country, and Lost Prophets sold millions of albums around the world. Like Savile, Watkins used his celebrity status to evade detection. South Wales police allegedly failed to properly investigate information about his behaviours in the years leading up to his arrest, which possibly led to an unnecessary 4-year delay in bringing him to justice. Watkins was killed while serving his sentence in 2025, and while I don't delight in anyone's death, some obituaries are certainly easier to read than others. Fred and Rose West were a married couple from southwest England who committed a series of revolting murders from 1967 to 1987. Their 12 known victims were all women, one of whom was their own daughter. They buried them under their house at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, which was nicknamed the House of Horrors. Fred was criminally charged for the murders, but he hanged himself before he could face justice. Rose was jailed for life, and she remains in prison today. As someone who grew up close to where Fred and Rose West committed their crimes, their names are often referenced in the context of stranger danger, but that doesn't get close to capturing the full depth of their depraved crimes, which are difficult to contemplate, let alone verbalise. It's become something of a dark internet meme in Britain to share their image under false pretenses. In 2014, a Twitter user tricked Donald Trump into retweeting their picture, and in 2020, a morning talk show in New Zealand was pranked into showing the pair live on air.
Today is the day that Francis and Violet Eastwood celebrate their 30th wedding anniversary. I love it.
Harold Shipman was one of the most prolific serial murderers in human history. Shipman was an English doctor who administered lethal doses of heroin to healthy elderly people, most of whom were women. An official report later concluded that Shipman killed between 215 and 260 people over a 23-year time period. His murders were only noticed after he attempted to forge the will of one of his victims. In the year 2000, Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he maintained his innocence from jail until he committed suicide in 2004. Because he refused to admit his guilt, we will never know for sure what his motives were. His name is now used in Britain to evoke the stereotype of a creepy and malicious doctor.
Literally, you just said the doctor thing makes sense. You save lives during the day, you kill people at night. So you're basically calling me like Harold Shipman or something. No,
that's a bit naughty to me.
In 1993, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, abducted and murdered a 2-year-old boy named James Bolger in northwest England. Thompson and Venables were tried in court as adults, where they were both found guilty, and their names were revealed to the public after the conclusion of the trial. After their release in 2001, they were given new identities and lifetime anonymity for their personal protection. Thompson isn't known to have reoffended since his release, but Venables is currently in prison for a separately terrible crime. Their new identities are still undisclosed. When the crime was initially publicised, British tabloids speculated that the killers may have been inspired by video nasties, which is a euphemistic British term for graphic and violent films. The most infamous claim was that Venables may have been inspired by a gruesome scene in Child's Play 3, in which one of Chucky's victims is beaten and splashed with blue paint. There isn't and never was any evidence to support that claim, but the film remains inextricably linked to James's death in the minds of the British public. The extremely young ages of both the victim and the perpetrators, coupled with the sadistic and seemingly motiveless nature of the crime, left a lasting impression on British culture. The killer's early release and lifetime anonymity is particularly contentious. To this day, James's death continues to provoke debate in the UK around young offenders, rehabilitative justice, and even the nature of evil itself. It is discussed in the opening chapter of a Terry Eagleton book, literally titled On Evil. In the aftermath of her son's death, James's mother set up a charity to remember her son positively. The James Bolger Memorial Trust benefits and supports young people who are the victims of bereavement, crime, and bullying. I'll include a link to the charity in the description in case you're able to donate. Okay, that's the end of this video. I'm sorry it got really depressing near the end, but hopefully it taught you something interesting about my wonderful, lovely country. I've heard that playing Tetris after a really traumatic event or once you've heard really traumatic information can help for some reason, so here's a bit of Tetris playing on the screen at the minute if this helps calm your nerves.